Morning, church. I'm Tina Leonardi, for those that don't know me. Thank you for your prayers, and we're honoured to serve Eagle's Nest Church. So, according to research, I've got to be careful because my husband's on PA and he can turn my mic off at any point. But what is the thing that annoys us the most? Any ideas? I'll tell you what number 2 is. Loud chewing. Loud chewing. So anyone idea what number 1 is?
Being on their phone when you're trying to talk to them.
Yeah, that's a good one. Being on your phone. Yeah, that's a good one. Oh, Dad. Pardon?
What was that?
Sorry? What? Being ignored. No, it's actually being late, not turning up on time. And I like to turn up on time. I try and get there 5 minutes before. But my husband says that when I first met him, that I was always late, which I just find hard to believe. So I just think he's got a bad memory and he's got a fast watch. So, have you ever called out to God and he's not turned up for you? You know, you called out, you're not getting the response you want. I know I have, and it's frustrating. You're praying, you're waiting for that answer to the prayer, and you're just not getting it. And then I think, well, is it because it's not God's plan? And then I think, well, what is God's plan, and who can fathom God's plan? So a prime example of when Jesus not showing up immediately when called on is the death of Lazarus. So that's what we're going to be focusing on, and I'll get straight into it with the scripture. So we're looking at John chapter 11. Now a man called Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." Notice how they said, "The one you love is sick." So they're emphasizing that because that puts more pressure on Jesus to act, which I think was really clever. And we know that Jesus was close friends with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus because it tells us in the Bible that he visited the home on several occasions. He stayed with them, he had food with them. You know, and they always made him feel welcome. He was really good friends. But we don't know what sickness Lazarus actually had, but we presume because they sent a message to Jesus, it was something that was progressive, it was something that he was going to die from. So who did they call in their hour of need? Who was there in case of emergency contact? It was Jesus. And it goes on to say, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. It doesn't say he loved them, but he had to stay where he was 2 more days because he was busy, he was doing urgent business. No, what it actually says is, so when he heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Now that just doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand it. He loved them. He really loved them. So why didn't he come when they asked for him? Why didn't he come when they needed him? Why didn't he come straight away? Now, if you was Martha and Mary, what would you be thinking? Somebody that you really relied on. I mean, they knew that Jesus would be able to heal the brother. They had faith that he'd be able to heal them. He loved them, he really loved them, but he just deliberately decided to stay 2 more days, not a rush in the world. So what could the reason for this be? Not too long before this, the Jews had tried to stone Jesus. Was that the reason? Did he fear for his life? I don't think so. I don't think my Jesus would have been afraid of that. What Jesus was actually doing was setting the scene for one of the greatest miracles of all time. But going back a bit where it says to Mary and Martha and they sent a word to Jesus, and I was thinking, how did they send the word to Jesus? Because there wasn't any mobile phones, there wasn't any email, and I bet they were gutted that there was no WhatsApp group chat. But no, the village of Bethany was located in Judea, south of the Mount of Olives near Jerusalem, and the only way they could have sent a message was to send somebody on foot, and it was about 20 miles, so it would have took a day to get there, and it would have took a day to get back. So by the time that Mary and Martha would have seen the messenger again, 2 days would have gone by. And then can you imagine a face when it's just the messenger that's come back? There's no Jesus with the messenger, and you can just imagine the utter disappointment. And I wonder what the messenger would have said. I wonder what excuse the messenger would have given. And I wonder if that was the messenger that coined the phrase, "Don't shoot the messenger." But what questions would Mary and Martha be asking? Doesn't he love us? Doesn't he care about us? Are we not important to him? Don't we matter to him? It then goes on to say, when he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it's for the glory of God, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." And then he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." "But Rabbi, a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back." The disciples thought that Jesus was out of his mind for even contemplating going back. But Jesus knew how his mission was going to end, and that was going to be on the cross. So there's no way he would have been frightened to go back. Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by the world's light. It's when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought that he meant natural sleep. I can just imagine the disciples saying, if he's poorly, just let him have a bit of a long rest, let him have a sleep, he'll be better. They definitely didn't want to go back. They remembered that they were nearly stoned. They'd rather him sleep it off. And Jesus knew that Lazarus was dead, and it must have made him chuckle a bit, thinking that his disciples thought that it was sleeping. And sometimes the disciples didn't act the brightest, should I put it, and they were not very quick at twigging on. And Jesus would have needed to be blunt with them. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then I really, really love this part. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." That is just what you need to hear, isn't it? And I think we all know a Thomas, don't we? It's the same doubting Thomas who refused to believe that, in the resurrected Jesus until he could stick his fingers in the wounds, and he was definitely not an optimistic person. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But Mary stayed at home. I find it interesting that only Martha came out, and she's ready to give Jesus a piece of her mind, turning up late. But Mary, she stayed at home. She was probably sulking, wanting to give him the silent treatment, when in effect, actually, she would have been back at the house with all the mourners that had gathered, so that was the reason she would have been there. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Wow, and she's totally putting the blame on Jesus. And I think Jesus had a sense of humour, actually. I really do. I think he would have had a sense of humour, but there's a place and a time for everything. So, I'm hoping he didn't say better late than never. It wouldn't have been appropriate. But Martha is definitely not mincing her words. She's putting the blame on Jesus, and she's, which we can all do from time to time, I'm sure, when we're feeling frustrated, when we're feeling that he's not showing up. Jesus, why are you letting me go through this really tough time? Jesus, when am I going to see my kids saved? Jesus, when are you going to answer my prayers? When are you going to heal me? Jesus, where are you when I really need you? Martha really believed in Jesus, but she was feeling really incredibly hurt and upset. But then she goes on to say this, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one that believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who has come into the world. After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here and he's asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and she went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but he was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. So what else do we know about Lazarus? We know he lived with his two sisters, and that wouldn't have been that uncommon in the day. We can assume he wasn't married because there's never any mention of wife or children, and he would have been around 30 years old. But there is one thing that we can definitely say about Lazarus, and that is he was loved. He was loved by his sisters. He was loved by Jesus. He was loved by many, because it says there was a large crowd of mourners there. Then it goes on, verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So she used the exact same phrase as Martha. She's totally putting the blame on Jesus. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews that had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And then it's interesting what the very first thing he does then. And it's the shortest phrase in the Bible and one of the most compelling. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Two words that just shows us completely how he totally shares in our pain. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loves him. They thought that Jesus was crying because Lazarus was dead, when in reality he was crying because it troubled to see all the people that loved him and how upset they were, all the mourners. And he was troubled to see the pain, and he's troubled when he sees our pain. And this is why he died for us. And I can imagine what a moving picture that would have been to see Jesus sobbing, tearful, showing empathy, sympathy and compassion for the mourners of Lazarus, because he couldn't bear to see his friends suffering in their grief. And Jesus had compassion for Mary and Martha because he knew them personally. And he wept for them, but Jesus is no different now than he was then. And he knows all of us personally too, even if you don't know him personally. And when we're hurting, when we're lost, when we're at rock bottom, when we're at the end of our rope, when we're feeling like giving up, when we're putting the blame on him, he's there beside us, he's there with us, he's weeping with us, and he's weeping in the waiting. And he cares for you more than you can ever imagine. And he doesn't want you to suffer. He wants the best for you. And he shares our pain. And He just wants to take away all our burdens. Verse 37, but some of them said, could he not have opened the eyes of the blind man? I beg your pardon. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, by this time there is a bad odour, for he's been in there for 4 days. And just to point out, Jesus had carried out 2 other miracles where he'd raised people from the dead, but when he'd done those miracles, which were huge miracles obviously, they had only recently died, so that was Jairus' daughter and the widow's son. We don't actually know, like I say, what the cause of Lazarus' death was, but we do know that the body was in the tomb, that he'd been dead for 4 days. And when he died, his body would have been washed, it would have been wrapped in grave clothes, and it would have been anointed with oil. But after 4 days, the smell in that cave would have been awful, because the body would have started to rot and decay. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Many of the Jews who had come with Mary and had seen what he did believed in him. So can you imagine how breathtaking this miracle would have been after 4 days? And scary. I think it would have been a bit scary as well. Breathtaking and scary. And obviously I hope, one of the first things that Lazarus did was have a nice hot soak and a good old wash. But it is just an amazing miracle, and I would have loved to have been there to see it. But the 4-day thing, I was thinking, why 4 days? Is it significant? Why did he wait 4 days? And, I think it was definitely significant. It was significant and it was deliberate, because it says in verse 18, now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. I think Jesus was waiting because he knew that there would be a huge crowd gathering around. There would be, lots of mourners there gathering, and God wanted to have witnesses around for this miracle because he wanted there to be no doubt that he was the Son of God. But the other reason is, that it's important to mention, is according to Jewish belief, the soul of a recently departed person hovers over the body for 3 days. Yeah? So then they believe that after 3 days, the soul will depart, and that's when the body will start rot and decaying. So if Jesus had raised Lazarus back to life within the 3 days, the Jews would have claimed that there was not necessarily a miracle involved and that the spirit would have just returned to the body. So what Jesus is doing, because Lazarus had been dead 4 days, the body had started decomposing, Martha had already said that there was an odour coming from the grave, is demonstrating his undisputable power and authority over death itself, and he's preparing people for his own death and resurrection. Because this miracle was witnessed by so many Jews that had come to grieve with the family, so many people believed in Jesus, it was causing such a stir. So Jesus wasn't late, and Jesus is never late. He timed his entrance to perfection for maximum impact. And like I say, the raising of Lazarus is one of the most significant miracles because he used it to prepare his disciples and prepare the world. Jesus defeats death and the grave, and he proves without a shadow of doubt that he's the Messiah, and that we can put our faith in him as believers, that when we die, that he'll raise us from the grave to spend eternity with him. And the miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead is so well known that there's a medical term, the Lazarus effect, and this is for when somebody is declared clinically dead, suddenly regains blood flow, and appears to come back to life after CPR. The Lazarus miracle has inspired countless works of art and literature, and to this day, the tomb of Lazarus is still a pilgrimage site where you can go and visit, and you can even leave a review on TripAdvisor. But it's crazy, but it's true. Crazy, but it's true. I think everyone has a Lazarus. Everyone has a Lazarus in their life at some point or other. And by this, I mean where you've called on God and you don't think he's shown up yet. God, if you really love me, you'd do this for me. What are the areas in your life that you need resuscitating? Are you waiting in anticipation for God to turn up? Are you on the brink of despair? Are you waiting for Jesus to work the Lazarus effect in your life? My advice to you is, don't give up. So with hindsight, Mary and Martha learned that God could be trusted in all circumstances, even when nothing else makes sense. And we need to remember that God has a plan for us. But more than that, he wants us to live our lives trusting in him, even with the storms, even with the trials, even when we can't figure out what God's plan is for our lives. We need to know that his plan's better. We need to remember that he sees our suffering, and he won't waste any of our suffering. It won't be rendered useless, because he uses our suffering and he'll bring God's glory. Nothing is wasted by God. You might not even have a relationship with God yet. You might not know Jesus. You might have heard something and you think, I want to find out a bit more. And, if that's you, then I'd encourage you to speak to somebody after the service, because we'd love to tell you more about him and pray for you. Jesus could have carried out that miracle from where he was 20 miles away, and he could have done it from 10,000 miles away. But no, Jesus, he chose to act up close and personal. If he chose to heal Lazarus before he died, they would have just said it was a coincidence, that it wasn't even a miracle. But he chose to raise him in front of many witnesses so that they could see the miracle firsthand and the glory would go to God. No one would have believed it was possible until they saw it. I mean, he'd got odour coming from him. He'd been dead 4 days. After this miracle, the Jewish leaders, they wanted both Jesus and Lazarus dead because of the stir it was causing, because they knew that people were coming to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And if the band want to come up, as I'm just getting to the end, we know what happened with Jesus. We know that he went on to fulfill his mission, that he died on the cross for us, for our sins, demonstrating complete victory over death, once and for all humanity. But what happened to Lazarus? I was thinking, what happened to Lazarus? Well, he managed to escape the Jews, and it's believed that he went on to lead a church in Cyprus. And then he died at the age of 60, again, for good, this time. Well. And on his tomb, it's inscribed, Lazarus of the 4 days and the friend of Christ. But guess what? Guess what Lazarus means in Hebrew? God has helped. He was named Lazarus. That means God has helped. So the name he was given at birth was a prophetic name of things to come. So what is the Lazarus in your life? What are you waiting for God to turn up for? What are you crying out for help with? The Lazarus in your life could be a stronghold in your life. It could be an addiction you're trying to break. It could be that your marriage needs fixing. It could be that you're desperately wanting to start a family. It could just be that you just want to feel loved by Jesus. Don't think for a minute that he's not going to hear the cries of your heart. But what did Martha say back in verse 21? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. You see, Martha had faith, and she believed in what she couldn't see. This was before he'd even raised her brother from the dead. So whatever the Lazarus is in your life, God is saying you need to believe it to see it. You see, Jesus shows up intentionally late sometimes because of his love for us, because he wants to draw us closer to him. But no matter how overwhelming the odds, you can always rely on him. He's always going to pull you through, and God is never late. He's always on time. And when you understand that God is never late, you learn to wait differently. So hold on to that and never give up, because he'll never give up on you.